The next theme we're going to go over about this kind of turn of the century time here is going to be the theme of populism, which is a type of political belief and party, eventually be its own kind of party that really tries to be more grassroots, more representative of people. There's going to be some issues with race, especially in race and racism and continuing issues like that in the South. And also, of course, issues regarding race and also anti-immigrant sentiment that will arise with another wave of immigrants that come through. So it's a very busy time socially and politically during the almost turn of the century up to the turn of the century. And part of this sentiment comes from a lot of this populism sentiment comes from issues with labor and issues that farmers are facing as well. And the Farmers Alliance is kind of a proto-populist party movement that crops up. It was an organization of farmers, as the name implies, that was first organized in Texas in the 1870s. And by 1890, they have branches in 43 states. So it becomes very popular very quickly, this sort of political party based on the importance of farmers and agriculture. And what they do is it's essentially just an alliance where they're trying to um, protest against certain things that are troubling the agricultural population of the United States. One of the big things that they're protesting against is high interest bank loans because it costs a lot of money to buy property to farm on, and then the interest rates on the loans that you took out a loan to buy property was almost as much as what you were paying for. You ended up paying so much in interest on the loan that it was really impossible to financially to own a farm or to maintain one and make a profit off of it. So there were a lot of farms going under, people losing their farms because of the interest on the loan that they had to take out to buy the farm in the first place. So they're having a lot of issues financially with that. But also there was extremely high fees for shipping their finished products by rail. So anything that they grew, once they had to ship it out somewhere, it cost them so much that that was cutting into their profits as well. So a lot of these things that the farmers are facing, they're aligning themselves behind these issues. This is their platform, the Farmers Alliance, and they really do have a very strong message because it's true that they feed everybody. That without farmers, there'd be no food. So this very populist style of movement really takes off during this era because there are so many issues that this very important sect of the population is facing. And I've been kind of dabbling about something, this word populism. Populism really is like a people's party. It's the popular movement. It's the party of, the lower ranks, but also of the majority too, is kind of where that populist sentiment comes from. And that idea of populism, the idea of a people's party, something that is really representative of the lower echelons of society, but very representative of the majority, kind of forms its own party in the early 1890s, and they call themselves the Populist Party. And it becomes known by almost interchangeably with the People's Party. They call themselves the Populist, aka the People's Party. And it really is a continuation of the Farmers Alliance. So those three terms, the Farmers Alliance, the Populist Party, the People's Party, they all kind of coalesce into a very similar political platform. The Farmers Alliance does kind of morph into eventually the Populist, aka People's Party. And eventually it just becomes known as the Populist Party because you can't keep having like eight names for something. So they really want to appeal to ordinary people, the producing classes, farmers, miners, rural Americans, those who they feel are really contributing to society, but also the ones that are suffering the most from things like financial issues. And their campaign is really a campaign against this, and is a political party, so they're going to run candidates for offices. They're campaigning against banks, large corporations, and using a lot of the social networks that the Farmers Alliance set up, a lot of rural social networks, talking about the evils of big business and the need of the federal government to really regulate big business because they felt that it was harming them and their ability to be productive. So their real goal is to advocate for the rural population, but also just anybody who they see as a producer, anybody who they feel is being kind of crushed by the big boot of big corporations. And they really do want to elect officials that feel the same way they do, that will be representative of the needs of the people. And they're really hopeful that this will help bring about change for them, things that will protect them from price gouging, that will protect them from fees, all the stuff the Farmers Alliance was worried about as well. And it goes pretty well for them for a while. The Populist Party is popular. The message resonates with a lot of Americans. Even if they're not rural, they like the idea of a party that is for the people, that advocates for the needs and the interests of the lower classes. And they get so popular that by 1892 they run a third party candidate for president. And he doesn't do bad, which is indicative of how well the party was being received by the public. Because the populist candidate that they run for president is James Weaver. He was the former Union soldier from the Civil War, and he receives over 1 million votes for president, about 8.5% of the popular vote in total, and 22 electoral votes, which is, again, that's very good for a third party. Usually third parties are almost either they don't exist, they're just not running, or they just do so badly that nobody even takes notice of them. But Weaver was seen as a real candidate. Like he was seen as a real potential that he could possibly win. It's not enough though, even though in the presidential election of 1892, Weaver is not successful. A lot of the populists are still energized by the fact that they did so good anyway. The Weaver, you can see here this map of which states had electoral votes and a majority of the popular vote going for Weaver. You can see it's a lot of those rural states, the ones that have a lot of miners and farmers and agricultural products. So they went for Weaver, Kansas, North Dakota, Idaho, all those type of places. But it's not enough. It's still, the third party still struggles to do well. The Democrat Grover Cleveland won the election. He beats a Republican Benjamin Harrison with about 46% of the popular vote and a good majority of electoral votes. So you could see Weaver, he's still not doing so bad, considering. But despite that defeat, or even maybe perhaps energized by the fact that the defeat wasn't totally crushing, Weaver still did okay. Populists are still very active and prolific in the following years. One of the most famous actions is they helped orchestrate the Pullman Railroad strike in 1894. And this is when, in 1894, in Pullman, Illinois, a lot of the railroad workers working for the Pullman Car Company stopped working out of protest of low wages and poor treatment, which is essentially what a strike is. You just stop working because you're mad about certain things. And the Pullman Railroad Workers strike sparks similar strikes across the nation where other railroad company employees are going to walk out and stop working out of solidarity with the Pullman employees. And a lot of people, even if they're not a railroad employee, a lot of union workers will refuse to deal with any type of train that has a Pullman car on it, out of the Pullman company. You could see here a lot of people were pretty sympathetic to the Pullman workers. They felt that the Pullman company was extremely exploitative of their workers, sort of crushing them between low wages of high hours, a lot of hours that they were working, but also high rent that the workers were charged for the company-owned housing that they lived in. So they felt that it was a grinding situation for the working poor. And it's very effective, the Pullman Railroad Workers strike against the Pullman Company, because it's so prolific and railroads are so important. They're shipping so much. You remember the map of the railroad cars, that it cripples the United States almost instantly because the railroad workers aren't working and refusing to send the trains around. Everything is being shipped by rail, so nothing is moving during this strike. The president, Grover Cleveland, ends up putting in an injunction, which basically forces the strike to end. The federal government has to step in. The president steps in to end the strike. A lot of the leaders of the strike are put in prison, but it so even though the strike is kind of broken without getting a lot of concessions for the workers, public support for them rises greatly because they got a lot of publicity and they were able to put across a sympathetic message for their plight of being in a bad situation at the hands of the Pullman Company. So there's a lot of things there are some successes that the populists and that organized labor has during this era. The Pullman strike is arguably a success because it doesn't tarnish the reputation of organized labor any further. You know, it had been kind of suffering around the time of the Haymarket strike, and there was always still some kind of lingering sentiment that unionism was bad and that organized labor was dangerous and it was going to bring about anarchy. So the fact that the railroad strike does elicit a lot of sympathy is a lot of workers see it as a positive thing. Another platform that the populists run on that eventually ends up hurting them is something called free silver, where they figured that, okay, there's not enough, the reason that people are poor is because there's just not enough money in circulation. But you can't just print money without some type of precious metal backing it. A lot of money is on the gold standard. You know, the money is representative of gold there hanging out in Fort Knox. So the free silver campaign that the populists thought up was that, hey, let's coin everything based backed on silver currency. Just mint tons of coins using silver. There's plenty of that. And that means they would kind of print as much money as you absolutely wanted. And they thought that, hey, more money and more circulation means more money in people's pockets and farmers could pay off their debts. This is great. This is perfect. And one of the populist leaders, a guy named William Jennings Bryan, I'm pretty sure that's a picture of him here there. Either way, I don't care. I like the fact that they made a song about the free silver movement. Um, he made that a big part of his campaign for the 1896 presidential election because, yes, the populists are running another candidate in another presidential election. And Bryan really advocates for this. He said, let's just print lots of money that will solve all of the problems of impoverishment. So he was a congressman from Nebraska, strong advocate of farmers, of agriculture. And he really thought that this would help solve the issue for farmers if you just print enough money that all the farmers could have a lot of money in their pockets. And he would go on and on about, you know, if you burn down the cities, and leave the farms, the cities will crop up again overnight almost. But if you destroy the farms, grass will be growing in the streets of every city before long because it's the farms that maintain the nation. However, in the election of 1896, Bryan doesn't win. He ends up losing to Republican William McKinley. And a big reason why McKinley wins and Bryan loses is because a lot of Americans were rightfully concerned about the whole free silver thing. Because when you print a lot of money, the result is usually, without fail, lots of inflation because everybody suddenly knows that, hey, there's more money in people's pockets. Let's jack up the prices on everything. And it never really helps to help the economy. So people were very concerned that just blowing lots of money and printing tons of it, it would destroy the United States. McKinley campaigns on that, being like, hey, my opponent is not smart. He's going to destroy the economic structure of the nation by printing lots of worthless cash. And people are concerned enough that they end up voting for McKinley. The free silver platform, the idea of coining lots of silver and just printing tons of money, is credited very widely with destroying William Jennings Bryan's campaign and also just the reputation of the populists because the Republican Party was very, very good at decimating their reputation as just economically irresponsible individuals. So switching gears here now, let's start talking about the race part of this lecture. We talked about populism a lot and how that kind of rose and failed in one fell swoop there. We'll talk a little bit about racism and what's going on in the South because the South, yeah, we haven't talked about that since the Civil War. They're still there, the Southerners, they're still hanging out there, but they're not doing so well. They haven't really been doing that awesomely since the Civil War ended. Reconstruction's been hard, building back has been hard. And they're still really trying, they've always been trying to catch up to the North and the amount of factories and industry that the North has. And during this time, with all of the advancements, this Gilded Age, this seemingly endless opportunities for opulence and wealth, on that scene comes a Georgia newspaper editor named Henry Grady. And he advocates very heavily during this time that the South needs to improve itself. It needs to become a new South, and it needs to embrace all of the stuff that makes the North rich and powerful. Things like industry, factories, and much more diverse agriculture beyond cotton. And this is a picture of a very proud factory in the South, the first carload of steel made in Alabama. Wow, 1897, if you look at that. That's pretty late. There's been tons of steel coming out of states and cities in the North for a while, but people get behind Grady's message because they realize that yeah, the South really does need to be richer and more secure. They need to kind of embrace all the things that's making the North so powerful, and heavy industry is going to be one of them. They want to help them catch up. They want their cities to be to be more diverse economically. They're really hoping that this era of potential for wealth will be an era of new potential and new improvements for the South, a new South. But what's really harming the South too is not just their lack of industry, it's also the fact that they are still struggling with segregation and a lot of disenfranchisement and unequal opportunities for a big chunk of their population, which is the Black population in the South. Um, a lot of individuals down there. People really aren't there. Yes, there's a movement for women to vote, which we'll talk about, but there's a lot of issues with the fact that even though Black men are supposed to be allowed to vote because of the amendments that says, hey, you're supposed to vote, they're just really being kept away from the polls. So there is a lot of disenfranchisement still in the South. A lot of Black men are being kept away from their constitutional right to vote by things like poll taxes, which are eventually will become illegal, but it's essentially a fee to be able to vote. And a lot of people are too poor to afford the fee, or it just turns them off from voting because they're thinking, am I gonna buy food or am I gonna pay a poll tax and try to vote for a vote that probably won't even change the political structure of the South? And another thing keeping Black voters away are literacy tests. A lot of them are either illiterate or they're not literate enough for these literacy tests because they are extremely hard. The tests are almost impossible to pass. They're designed to make you fail, really. I remember one time when I was in like middle school social studies, our social studies teacher, he handed us out a literacy test and every single one of us failed because it was random things like what's the third clause of something in like Article 3 of the Constitution. We were panicking because we thought this was a real test. But it really showed to us very explicitly that these literacy tests were designed to turn you away. The way that poor white Southerners got around this were grandfather clauses, which said that if your grandfather could vote, then you are exempt from the poll taxes and the literacy tests. And in the 1890s, whose grandfathers were voting? Only white men. It was the grandfathers of anybody who was black was at that time, go back that many decades, they're enslaved, they weren't voting. So it was a way to allow poor and uneducated white Southerners to still vote while excluding black Southerners from the polls. Another thing going on in the South was a lot of segregation. After there was the Black Codes that we discussed about trying to basically put the South back to the same social structure during the Civil War that prevented Black Southerners from owning guns or even gathering in large groups. And what usually happened was to try to keep society apart, to keep the races apart, is a lot of things were segregated or separated, where there would be separate trains for blacks and whites, separate schools, separate drinking fountains, separate entrances to stores, separate everything. And there were certain social advocates who felt that this was not right and wanted to challenge it, and one of them was a black man named Homer Plessy who boarded a train that was supposed to be only for whites. He refuses to move to the colored only car. That was usually what it was called. It would be you'd see signs that would say colored only. That was the way that Black Americans knew that that was the section or the store designated for them. He refused to move to the colored car and claimed that a Civil Rights Act, and constitutionally he was allowed to it. But in 1896, the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson declared that no, it's a private businesses and private businesses are not the trains are private, they're owned by private companies. They're allowed to discriminate, and as long as these companies provided accommodations that were separate but equal, which meant that you can separate people as long as you provide equal opportunity. So if you are a train, if you want to segregate people, you have to provide equal train cars. Okay, the black one and the white one have to be like a similar quality. Same thing with schools. Like if you're going to segregate schools, you have to have the white schools have to be as good quality as the black schools. It's very hard to enforce that, but it kind of gives the South an excuse to be like, well, it doesn't matter if it's separate. It's equal. Everybody has the same thing. They're just happier. Everybody's happier this way. So Plessy versus Ferguson is the Supreme Court case that legalizes separate but equal. It sort of legalizes segregation by using this loophole of saying, well, as long as you've got it separate, it's fine. So the South really tr entrenches its segregation and its separation of races at this time. And it's not a good social situation because the any of the gains of Reconstruction have kind of been reversed. A lot of those radical Reconstruction amendments have been reversed by these workaround laws like the poll taxes and Plessy versus Ferguson with segregation in place. And a lot of any type of agitation on the part of Black Southerners to change the social situation or to advocate for equality is really curtailed by a lot of extreme violence in the South to sort of keep the social order in check. One of the most famous things that went on in the South to sort of encourage adherence to inequality was lynching, which is public execution, some type of public execution through mob violence. Usually, what it was you would have a group of people would, if there was somebody who was usually a black man, was usually the target of lynching. If there was a black man accused of raping or looking at a white woman or who was just kind of the usual term applied was uppity. Uppity is the spelling uppity. If someone was acting uppity and sort of trying to change or improve their lot or wasn't really sticking to the status quo and the social order, or if they were accused of some type of violence, they could be a target for lynching, which is that person is accused of any one of those things I mentioned. Mobs of people would get together and they would just hang somebody, usually from a tree or in some sort of public square, and it would become a real spectacle. I mean, they would take pictures of it, they would sell souvenirs of like the person's clothes after they were executed publicly, and it was designed to intimidate and terrorize black men, especially into not stepping out of line. There were about 150 of these lynchings or hangings or just any type of extrajudicial violence in the South, 150 per year from 1882 to 1901. Kind of peaked in 1892 with an estimated 231 lynchings in that year in the South. And a lot of people would simply leave. There was a lot of Black Southerners left the South. There was a movement of people they got nicknamed the Exodusters because of a mix between exodus, like leaving, biblical leaving, and also the fact a lot of them went west to Kansas to escape the violence of the South, the lynching and the inequality. So they became known as Exodusters they're exiting and they're going into a dusty area. Very clever. Um, but lynching still was quite prevalent, and there is a memorial to lynching victims in Montgomery, Alabama. 2018, it was completed, and it's very indicative of, there's a lot of structures hanging, and I believe there's like names etched on a lot of these pillars, but it's designed to kind of commemorate a lot of the lives that were lost in this uh, attempts to really terrorize Black men in the South from trying to change their political and social situations. So, but that doesn't mean that nobody was saying anything. Um, there was a consensus going on among the Black community that they kind of realized that a full frontal assault against segregation and inequality wasn't really possible. And this is really articulated um, by by writer Booker T. Washington, something known as the Atlanta Compromise. The Atlanta Compromise is the name given to a speech that Booker T. Washington gave in 1895, where he kind of encourages the African American community in the South to not try so hard to be very vocal and agitative, and instead sort of turn inward and focusing on building up their segregated communities. His rationale behind this was, okay, if they want us to be separate, let's make our separate part awesome. Let's educate ourselves. Let's try to make money and have a nice life and really just and focus on self-improvement. If they're going to force us to be on our own and to force us to be separate, let's make sure our separate part is just really fantastic and focus on self-improvement, self-reliance, and not really push back too hard against segregation, because he just felt it was not the Black community wasn't strong enough or well organized enough to really launch that full frontal assault um, against the institutions of the South. And he felt that, they just really needed to wait. They should get good jobs, educate themselves, and sort of focus inward. And that was kind of a compromise where the Black community wouldn't really agitate for change because they wanted to be kind of left alone to focus on self-improvement. So it's kind of a couple explanations as to why it takes so long for there to be a real push for social change in the South. It's not really till the 50s, 60s, 1950s, 1960s that there is that strong civil rights movement. I'm probably familiar with that. If you've ever seen footage of Martin Luther King and all those protests, that's the 50s and 60s. But why does it take so long? Well, you've got violence and terror from lynching that is keeping people pretty subdued, but also this idea that we're going to turn our focus inward on self-improvement. So now that we've talked about that, let's talk a little bit about racism towards new immigrants as well, because there are quite a bit of new immigrants coming into the United States that are going to be faced um, with some prejudice as well. And there's a big influx of immigrants coming in the 1890s, this sort of Gilded Age. We talked about them coming in for those factory jobs and ending up living in tenements. Um, there's a wave of about 3 million or so immigrants that come in during the 1880s, 1890s. They're seeking work and they're coming in from new places than a lot of the immigrants had in the past. That's why they're called the new immigrants during this era. Prior to this, most of the immigrants coming to the United States came from the areas like England and Western Europe, like Germany. And that was a lot of the people that had come in during the 1840s and even earlier. I mean, a lot of the United States was settled by the English, the Irish sometimes, but a lot of mostly English. And during the early 1800s, there was a wave of immigrants from Ireland and Germany who were faced with a lot of prejudice, but they'd kind of established themselves pretty well in the United States and had ended up gaining a fair amount of respect. And it was seen as very respectable to be of Anglo-Saxon background, of English German descent. But now the new immigrants are coming from new areas that had not been in the United States before. A lot of them are from they're from Eastern Europe. They're from places like Italy and Poland and Russia, and they're seen as very backwards, very old world, very unsophisticated, and they're seen as just totally inimical to everything the United States stands for. A lot of them have more socialist forms of government. They're seen as incompatible with democracy. And there's a lot more new immigrants coming from Asia as well, from China and Japan to the West Coast, places like California, drawn in by jobs and opportunities there. So there's a lot of immigration coming in and a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment following them. We talked about nativism, sort of the belief in the superiority of the people that already exist in a certain country. And nativism raises its head again with this new wave of immigrants coming in. And it's just called new nativism because it pops up again. It's new. What's old is new. And new nativism is nativism directed at these new immigrants and belief that they are racially, literally biologically inferior to the people that are living there, that people who are Italian or who are Jewish or Asian are of a lower social and like species than white Americans and people who are of English background, we'll say. That was considered like an Anglo background. And there were a lot of fears related to all of these people coming in, especially Italy. Italians really they were really a target of a lot of nativism. Italians and Asians, a lot of disdain for those groups coming in. They were seen as completely incompatible with American society. And these nativist beliefs really harbored a lot of fear about the bad changes that these immigrant groups would bring. Um, a lot of them feared, especially that Italians would bring in a lot of violence. You could see the cartoon here. This little shoot says, direct from the slums of Europe daily, and who's coming out? It's rats that are caricatures of Italian faces. They've got like mafia, anarchist, violence. They're bringing socialism, they're bringing guns, and they're scurrying onto the boat of the United States while Uncle Sam looks on very concerned there about the rats that are entering. Um, there was sort of a lot of fear of like just the violence and political change. So the violence, obviously, that there was a fear early on that the Irish were really violent. There's a fear again that the Italians are super violent, that they're all gangsters and mafia members and very quick to anger. But also a fear that they would destroy American democracy since they came from countries that didn't have it, or at least didn't have it in the same capacity that the United States did. They're fearing that it's Italian immigrants that are bringing political ideas like anarchism, which advocate for a total lack of structure in a government, or socialism, that they're bringing in the ideas of Karl Marx and communism, that they're going to dilute the American political system and destroy it when they come and they vote for ideas that are opposite of what the Americans who are already living there believe in. There's also just a fear that something would happen known as race suicide. And race suicide is the belief that the white race could never compete and give birth to enough babies to keep up their population with the new immigrants coming in. There's a very strong belief that immigrants are like incredibly fertile, and especially Italians and the Irish too. I don't know, there's still stuff going on with them. Even in this era too, there's still a little bit of anti-Irish sentiment every now and then. The idea that they would come and have like every family would have like 12 children, and that the white families that only had two or three would just never keep up, that they would commit race suicide by not being able to reproduce fast enough to keep up with the immigrants pouring into the country. And there is just a lot of sentiment about this. This is again directed a lot about against Italians. Um, and also a lot of it directed against Asians as well. One of it was in 1875, a California representative named Horace Page proposed a law to prohibit more of the entry of Chinese immigrants because they saw them as immoral and unable to comply with anything that really made the United States, that they had too many different culture, different background, that they were just simply also a totally different race as well, that they were biologically different from Americans. And Horace Page, he gave his name to this Page Act that was designed to specifically prohibit the entry of Chinese women because he felt that they were all immoral and would only be working as prostitutes, and it would really harm the overall um, quality of the United States by having too many people who are very different in the country. And the Page Act that served to restrict Chinese immigration was the first restrictive immigration law ever put in place, especially one that was aimed at a certain racial group. So it has the dubious distinction of being the first one to try to restrict a single race coming in. And it's not just fears of Chinese women coming in and only being able to find work as prostitutes. There was also a fear that Chinese laborers would work so cheaply that nobody else would ever be able to get a job because they would just undercut all of the wages. So there's a lot of really strong anti-Asian sentiment here that is codified in restrictive immigration laws like the Page Act. And it goes even further with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 because it goes a little further to try to exclude more than just Asian women. It goes to exclude more Chinese immigrants as well. There are several reasons why there was more vigorous attempts to exclude the Chinese at this time. Part of it goes back to some strikes that happened in Massachusetts, actually. In a shoe factory in Massachusetts in 1870, known as the North Adams Shoe Factory, there was a strike, so the workers stopped working. The shoe factory workers just walked out because they were protesting low wages. And instead of compromising with the workers and trying to come to a satisfactory compromise there, the North Adams Shoe Factory employees brought in Chinese workers to take over because they just didn't want to bother to pay their workers more. And that terrified Americans. They thought, oh no, workers, lower class workers, impoverished people, union employees were terrified of the Chinese because they felt that Chinese individuals, that was going to keep happening. If they were in the country, factories are like, who cares? Go on strike. We'll just replace you with Chinese immigrants. It's also exacerbated by a economic depression that occurred in 1873, known as the Panic of 1873. And that economic downturn it was just sort of a regular, up and down in the economy that happens for recessions and whatnot. But it happened during this era of fear about Chinese immigrants, and they were very quickly blamed for it. The idea that it was them for coming in and depressing the economy and working so cheap everywhere. All of these labor fears showed that it almost felt like they were justified. Like, see, this is happening because there's so many Chinese immigrants working too cheaply. And there's a lot of fears of unions that this is going to keep happening. So the Chinese Exclusion Act is passed in 1882, sort of building on the Page Act to go a little further and suspend all immigration from China for the following 10 years. So they really wanted to exclude it quite heavily and restrict it in that sense. It is eventually repealed, but it's not until World War II. So it goes to show that this was quite extensive, and there was not just a simmering anti-immigrant sentiment, it was heavily codified in a lot of the restrictive laws at the time.